Så da skal vi begynne konferansen med det første innlegget. It is a pleasure to wish you, Michael Johnson, very welcome to our conference. Michael P. Johnson is Emeritus Professor in Sociology, Women's Studies, and African American Studies. His current research focuses on the implications of differentiating among types of violence in intimate relationships. We look forward to hear you about that matter. He is widely published in scholarly journals, and he is internationally recognized expert in domestic violence, invited to speak at conferences in universities throughout the United States and around the world. Welcome, Michael Johnson. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I have very warm feelings about Scandinavia. We feminists all love the Nordic countries. They're the model that we all look up to for what the rest of the world should be like in the future. But I also have some personal ties to the Scandinavian countries. Min farfar från Arvika I Värmland, Sverige. Och min far... Tack, jag ska försöka. Och min farmor från Lammhult I Småland, Sverige. Och min mormor från Köpenhamn. Ja. Och jag studerade vid Stockholms universitetet för 50 år sedan. Och lärde mig lite svenska som jag har nu glömt bort. So I will speak in English, of course, because you've heard enough of my awful Swedish. If you don't mind, I think I'm going to just wander about instead of standing up here at the podium. And we'll see how that goes. I have one point to make today. So, well, let me point out the website here first. All of the slides that I'll be doing today, this morning, and this afternoon will be on my website in about a week when I get back to the United States. So if you would simply write down this website address, well, I think it's probably in your program as well. You can go there to see these slides and to see any of my recent papers. I keep all my papers up on my website. Today I'm going to make one simple point. I'll give you lots of information about it, but the basic point is that there's more than one kind of intimate partner violence. That in fact there are three major types and a few other smaller types, but the three major types differ dramatically from each other, that they're completely different in their dynamics, in their development, in their consequences. So that's the big point today. You could leave now and you'd know what I have to say. Let's see if we can get this working. All right, now we have it working. So here's an outline of the things I'm going to try to get through today. I have about an hour, so I'll move fairly quickly. And I am a sociologist, so I apologize. I'll be presenting numbers. I'm a sociologist. I'm a researcher. I'm not a clinician, so I'll be presenting to you the results of research, not just my own research, but research done by many other people on this issue of the differences among the types of intimate partner violence. And I'm going to start with a brief discussion of the anti-feminist backlash that we're experiencing very strongly in the United States and in Canada. I don't know what's happening here with that respect. In the US and Canada, we have some very politically active men's rights groups that have taken it upon themselves to attack the great progress that we've made in the last 30 years in the area of violence against women. And they focus their arguments around three major points. First of all, of course, they attack feminist research as biased, which we feminists sort of chuckle at because their research is so deeply biased that we just have to laugh when they point at our work and argue that it's ideologically based and biased. But they publish articles regularly attacking our research. Second, they deny the role of gender in intimate partner violence. They present evidence that they claim supports the view that women are as violent as men in intimate relationships. Those of you who work in these areas know how ridiculous that idea is. But they're able to marshal evidence that's convincing in the public media. And so we have to respond to this backlash in order to keep it from having an influence on funding for our programs. And third, they directly attack programs that are focused on violence against women, arguing that if you accept their assumption that women are as violent as men in intimate relationships, then the whole shelter movement, for example, in the United States is sexist, it's biased. It's focused primarily, or they would say entirely, although that's not true, but it is focused primarily on violence against women. They attack the Violence Against Women Act, which is under attack now in the Congress in the United States, as biased because it's focused on women when in fact men are victims as often as men are. Did I say no? Men are victims as often as women are. So what I have to say today is in large part a response to this anti-feminist attack on the argument that intimate partner violence is a problem largely of violence against women. How is it? When I first got into this work 20 years ago, I was puzzled to find that, I was puzzled even 20 years ago, that we were still arguing over whether or not women were as violent as men in intimate relationships. How is it that we could still be debating such a basic point? The reason that we're still debating this is that there is research evidence that appears to support the argument that women are as violent as men in intimate relationships, and that's the evidence that the anti-feminists are fond of reporting to us. This chart will give you an idea of the kind of style I'm going to be using throughout this presentation today. I'll be showing you multiple studies, data from multiple studies, done in different countries often, different years by different researchers that all show the same results. So we'll be looking at the larger patterns. The specific numbers aren't as important as are the big patterns that I'll show you. So the first point I want to make is that in general survey data, not just in these studies, but in hundreds of other studies like these, we find that women report that they're violent towards their male partners as often as men report that they're violent toward their female partners. Data from Canada, from Norway, from Sweden, from hundreds of studies in the United States and Canada, in general surveys, consistently show that women are almost as likely to be violent toward their partners in intimate relationships as are men. I'm going to be focusing on heterosexual relationships. If we have time for questions at the end, if you want to ask me about intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships, we can talk about that as well. There's another body of evidence that shows quite a different pattern. That's the evidence from all sorts of agencies that deal with violence. Similarly, there are hundreds of studies done in agencies that consistently show that men are the primary perpetrators of violence in intimate relationships. Here again, multiple studies looking at different aspects of violence. Here, partner assault. In Sweden, police statistics, 80% of the violence in heterosexual relationships is perpetrated by men. In Norway, ill-treatment, a category that most other countries don't use, 77% of the ill-treatment in intimate relationships perpetrated by men. Canada, spousal homicide, 82%. You can see multiple studies in different settings, emergency rooms, family court. We find that men are the primary perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory bodies of evidence, all legitimate research done by reputable social scientists and government agencies? And the answer to that has to do with my main point today, that there is more than one kind of intimate partner violence. The different kinds of intimate partner violence are differently gendered. There are three major types. One type perpetrated almost entirely by men in heterosexual relationships, another type perpetrated primarily by women, and a third type perpetrated roughly equally by men and women. And we have two major ways of doing research, two major sampling plans that are used in our research. In general survey research, in so-called random sample representative surveys, are biased toward the situationally provoked violence that's perpetrated roughly equally by men and women. The reason is that our so-called representative surveys aren't really representative. We start out with a random sample that would be representative of the population if everybody responded to the survey. And then we get response rates that at best run 40 to 50%. So roughly half the people that we contact to participate in the survey refuse to participate. And those refusals lead to biases in the kinds of people that we interview who've been violent, biased in the direction of the kinds of violence that are perpetrated by both men and women. Agency studies are, maybe being down here is a bad idea. I get in front of some of you, don't I? I thought it would be better if I were down here instead of up there. And agency studies are biased in a different way. They're biased in the direction of the kind of coercive, controlling violence that's perpetrated almost entirely by men. So if you look at the agency studies, you're looking at one kind of intimate partner violence perpetrated primarily by men. If you look at the general survey research, you see data that focus primarily on what I call situational couple violence, which is perpetrated roughly equally by men and women. Now, it's important to remember these distinctions. When the media report data on intimate partner violence, you want to look carefully at what kind of data they're presenting. If the media present data from general surveys, then you can be sure that, that they're presenting data on situational couple violence, and that those data are probably not relevant for the kind of violence that we're most used to dealing with in our clinical work, the coercive, controlling violence that's perpetrated primarily by men. So this typology of intimate partner violence provides the answer to that seemingly contradictory research data. And now I'm going to just give you an overview of what the major types of intimate partner violence are that I identify. There are three major types: intimate terrorism, which involves a pattern of violent, coercive control; violent resistance, which is the violence that's perpetrated in resisting the intimate terrorist; and third, situational couple violence, which is violence that comes about in couples in which conflicts turn to arguments, the arguments escalate to verbal aggression, and ultimately to physical aggression. There are two other kinds of intimate partner violence that have been identified in the literature. I'm not going to talk about them at length. They're much less common. One is separation-instigated violence, which you see, that's the violence that occurs for the first time in the relationship when the couple is separating. There are some couples that have no history of coercion, no history of control, no history of violence, but during the problems that arise during their split, one or both of them becomes violent. It's a very different kind of pattern. It's a pattern which clinicians argue is normally very short-lived, and it does not pose a risk for ongoing violence in most cases. The second minor type down at the bottom here is mutual violent control. Some researchers, myself included, have identified a very rare pattern in which what you basically have is two intimate terrorists vying for control in the relationship. Two coercive, controlling partners in combat with each other to try to control the relationship. It's very rare, and there's even some question whether or not there's some flaws in our research that there really isn't a stable pattern like this that will always turn into one of the other patterns. So I'm going to focus on the three major types of intimate partner violence. You're probably most familiar with what I call intimate terrorism. I work on the term intimate terrorism. It's a term that I chose over 20 years ago when it didn't have the kind of problems with the term terrorism that we now have with a world that's dealing with terrorism constantly. So in the courts now in the United States, we use the term coercive controlling violence to avoid the emotional connotations of the term terrorism. But I chose the term because what it involves is one partner terrorizing the other partner in order to attempt to gain complete control over her and the relationship. In most cases, in heterosexual relationships, is perpetrated almost entirely, but not entirely, by men. It involves, you've probably seen this coercive control wheel developed by Pence and Paymar of the Duluth Project. We use it a lot in the United States, and I think you probably use it here as well. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. What it involves is the physical and sexual violence around the outside that holds together a pattern of nonviolent coercive control tactics. So what we look for when we're trying to identify intimaterism is a pattern of the use of a variety of tactics to attempt to control a partner. Coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, keeping the partner from contacts with other people, and so on. An intimaterist will use whichever of these nonviolent tactics will work in his or her situation. So the pattern doesn't always involve all of them, it involves some combination of them. And the power of these nonviolent coercive tactics is enhanced by them being embedded in a pattern of physical violence. Once you've been beaten by your partner, then emotional abuse takes on a much more powerful controlling element than it does if you haven't been beaten. Threats become meaningful if you've been beaten by your partner. Isolation, when your partner says, I don't want you contacting your relatives anymore, that's not just taken as a request if you've been beaten by your partner, but as a demand that if you don't fulfill, may result in another beating. So intimaterism does not necessarily involve the constant use of violence. Sometimes the violence establishes the control and terrorizes the partner enough that the intimaterist can continue to control his partner without the frequent use of violence. Although in egalitarian societies like ours, where women do not expect to be controlled, do not want to be controlled by their partners, the resistance that you would expect leads often to escalation and frequent violence. Not always, but often. So this pattern is defined not necessarily by the level of violence, but by the pattern of multiple tactics used to try to take complete control over one's partner. When we do research on this, we use items like this. These are from the National Violence Against Women survey that's been used in the United States and in Canada. You can see it's a series of questions about nonviolent control tactics, and we look for a pattern in them. We use a cutoff of 5 or more of these in our research to identify coercive controlling violence. So if the partner has ever been violent in any way whatsoever and has used at least 5 of these 9 control tactics, we identify that as intimaterism. If not, we would call it situational couple violence or violent resistance. So, intimaterism involves a general pattern of violent, coercive control in an attempt to exert general control over the partner. There's one basic pattern, but there are a lot of variations on it depending upon the situation of the couple. For example, in same-sex couples, the threat to out your partner at work if your partner is not out at work, or out your partner to relatives if they don't know that he or she is gay, can be used as a control tactic. If it's an immigrant couple, then threats to turn one into immigration authorities can be used. So the tactics are specific to the particular relationship and vary from case to case. In heterosexual relationships, it's perpetrated primarily but not exclusively by men. I've worked with men who were being terrorized by their partners, and the pattern looks very much like the pattern that we see when men terrorize their female partners. One man that I worked with at some length was married to a police officer who terrorized him in all the same ways that men typically terrorize their male intimate terrorists typically terrorize their female partners. She used her weapons, she beat him, she threatened him. He couldn't go to the police because the police were all her buddies. He had children, so he couldn't escape without leaving the children with this intimate terrorist. So he was struggling with all of the dilemmas that female victims of intimate terrorism struggle with. But I want to emphasize that the vast majority of these cases are perpetrated in heterosexual relationships by the men. There are two major subtypes that have been identified for male intimate terrorists. The research of Amy Holdsworth Monroe has been groundbreaking on this, and she identifies two major types. First, there are the emotionally dependent intimate terrorists. These are men who have serious attachment issues, who are deeply emotionally dependent on their partner and are so desperate to keep her that they feel they have to control her. They're insanely jealous. They monitor her behavior constantly, and they try to control her in many other ways in a desperate attempt to make sure that they don't lose her. Ironically, of course, in most cases, this leads to them losing her. So you see the dynamic there, though, is one of emotional dependency focused particularly on one's partner. The second major type of intimate terrorist, Holdsworth Monroe calls the antisocial pattern. These are men who simply will have their way and will use whatever tactics they need to get their way in many situations. They're likely to have been involved with the police for reasons other than domestic violence. They control not only their partner, but other people as well. They're simply people who will have their way and will use whatever tactics they need to get them. So the dynamic there is not that they're particularly emotionally dependent on their partner, but they simply want what they want and they'll do what they need to do to get it. If their partner leaves them, they're likely to say, fine, I'll find somebody else to control. I'll find somewhere else I can get what I want. As opposed to the emotionally dependent men who are the main source of murder-suicides. When their partner tries to leave them, they can't live without their partner. They'd rather kill her and themselves than live without their partner. Intimate terrorists refuse to participate in survey research. We don't see them in the general surveys because they don't want to implicate themselves. So when the survey researcher shows up at the door or calls on the telephone, they refuse to participate. And that's one of the reasons that general surveys are biased against getting at this kind of violence. The second reason that general surveys have very few of these is that this is not a very common kind of intimate partner violence. That may sound ironic to those of you who work with violence in families, because the people who come to the attention of agencies are likely to be of this type. But if you go out into the general population and look at violence between partners in the general population, most of that violence is not intimate terrorism. Intimate terrorism occurs, we don't have good numbers on it. I'm going to throw out numbers which I don't want you to believe. They're very rough. It's very hard to get numbers on this kind of thing. We extrapolate from shelter data, and extrapolating from shelter data, we could estimate that 1 in 50 to 1 in 25 couples experiences intimate terrorism. So you can see it's a very small percentage of the population, as opposed to something like 12% of the population that experiences some kind of violence between partners every year, most likely situational couple violence. Let me get a drink and pause. You can absorb that a bit while I get a drink. This feels strange not to allow questions in the middle of this, but I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to charge on through and hope that I'm making sense. Okay, the second major type of intimate partner violence is violent resistance. Many victims of intimate terrorism do respond with violence. Some of our shelter data in the United States suggests that nearly 2/3 of female victims of male intimate terrorism respond at some point with violence of their own. It's not necessarily self-defense. I'm very careful not to use the term self-defense for it, because sometimes it's retaliation. It's not self-defense. Self-defense is defined by the law, and in the United States, the definition of it differs from state to state. Violent resistance sometimes is self-defense, sometimes is an attempt to stop an attack that's in progress, but not always. Sometimes it's retaliation. Sometimes the woman who's being violent towards her intimate terrorist partner knows that she's not going to stop him, but she feels like he should have to pay a price for his attempt to control her, and so she retaliates. And in the best known cases, that retaliation rises to the point of homicide. The famous cases like the burning bed case of the woman who waits until who waited, as an actual case, who waited until her partner was asleep and then doused him with gasoline and set him on fire. Now, it wasn't self-defense, but it was violent resistance. Of course, most cases of violent resistance don't become homicides. In fact, we have an interesting pattern in the United States that since the shelter movement became widespread in the United States, starting in the early 1990s, female homicides against their male partners began to decline dramatically in the United States. Because women had alternatives. They could escape from intimate terrorists because the shelter movement provided them the kind of support they needed to get safely out of those relationships. So although male murders of their female partners stayed high, female murders of male partners declined fairly dramatically through the 1990s and up until today. So that now in the United States, there are roughly 3 times as many men who murder their intimate partners as women who murder their male intimate partners. In heterosexual relationships, most violent resistors turn to other tactics because violent resistance doesn't work very well when you're a woman being terrorized by a man who's larger and stronger, is more used to violence, more willing to use violence, and in the case of an intimate terrorist, willing to escalate that violence as much as he needs in order to gain control. So the violent resistors typically desist and turn to other tactics to try to mitigate the violence or to escape from the relationship. The most common tactic for trying to mitigate the violence is to be compliant, to simply try to be what he wants you to be. Although in the case of many intimate terrorists, that you simply can't fulfill their wishes. You cannot be compliant enough to satisfy them. So the controlling and the potential for violence continues through the relationship. And most violent resistors ultimately leave the relationship. My favorite study of this follows women for 2 years after contacting a shelter, and in just 2 years after the contact with the shelter, 2/3 of the women experiencing intimate terrorism had either left the relationship or have eliminated violence from the relationship. So most violent resistors do ultimately turn to getting out of the relationship to escape the violence. Violent resistors also refuse to participate in survey research. Victims of intimate terrorism are afraid to participate in survey research about their family life for fear of the consequences if their partner finds out that they were answering questions about what's going on in their relationship. So neither the intimate terrorists or their victims are likely to be willing to participate in survey research, and what we're left with then in the surveys is almost entirely the third major type of intimate partner violence, situational couple violence. This is by far the most common kind of intimate partner violence. It involves conflicts that turn into arguments, that become verbally aggressive, and that escalate to physical violence. Both men and women are likely to be involved, are as likely to be involved in situational couple violence. That doesn't mean that every couple that experiences this kind of violence involves mutual violence. In about a fourth of the cases, it's only the man who's violent. In about a fourth of the cases, it's only the woman who's violent. And in the other half of the cases, both the man and the woman have been violent at one point or other in the relationship. So it's not always mutual violence. It can be mutual or it can be one-sided. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that because men and women are equally likely to perpetrate situational couple violence, don't fall into the trap of believing that there's true gender symmetry here. The men's violence is much more likely to injure and much more likely to frighten the partner. So all of the data on the consequences of male violence show that in situational couple violence, although men and women are equally likely to do it, the consequences are dramatically different. You can just imagine, easy to imagine, the difference between a 100-pound woman being slapped by a 250-pound man versus the other way around. They're very different kinds of experiences, although on the conflict tactics scale it looks the same. He slapped her, she slapped him, it looks symmetrical, but if you look at injury and fear, the differences are dramatic. There's huge variability in situational couple violence. Unlike intimate terrorism, where they're all pretty much the same, they all involve a pattern of coercive control, situational couple violence is extremely variable. For example, in 40% or more of the cases of situational couple violence that are identified in survey research, there's only been one incident of violence. An argument escalated, turned violent, may have been a slap, may have been a shove, may have been a very serious injury, but the couple is horrified by what's happened, they deal with it themselves, and there's never violence again in the relationship. So for close to half of the cases of situational couple violence, you're dealing with one incident. For the other half, or a little more than half, there's chronic violence. It may just be a few incidents a year, or in some cases it may be constant arguing and that turns to violence. So the violence in here's another trap. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that situational couple violence is not severe. It can be homicidal, it can be chronic, it can be homicidal. So we need to intervene in situational couple violence as much as we need to intervene in intimate terrorism. The causes of chronic situational couple violence vary from couple to couple. There is, of course, the chronic conflict that couples face. This is one of the reasons one of the patterns that we find in the research on situational couple violence is that it's more frequent in poorer families. The poorer the family, the higher the rates of situational couple violence because of the conflicts that are created by the tensions of dealing with poverty, or in the United States also dealing with racism. We see race differences in situational couple violence. They also include substance abuse, anger issues, all of the things that I've worked in the battered women's movement in the United States, and in our training in our shelters, we tell people the violence is never caused by the alcohol, it's never an anger management problem, because we're so focused on intimate terrorism as our major model that we dismiss these as possible causes of the violence. But anger issues, substance abuse, and communication issues are deeply implicated in situational couple violence. And our interventions in situational couple violence need to focus on those things if we want to reduce this kind of violence, which is, after all, the most common kind of violence between partners. Couples who are involved in situational couple violence are willing to participate in survey research, so we see them in the general survey data, and the general survey data are dominated by situational couple violence. Let me ask if there are any questions. Let me give you a chance if anybody has a question right now before I move on. All right, let's look at how these distinctions among the types explain the differences in the data from the different sources. First of all, let's look at the gender asymmetry, symmetry of these types of violence. And again, as I said, I'll always present data from more than one study. There are other studies that have now established this, but I'm going to start with the first study that I did. I got data from research that was conducted in the 1970s in Pittsburgh that involved a mixed sample that included both a general survey sample and samples from the courts, women who'd filed protection from abuse orders, and from shelters in the Pittsburgh area. So this was a study that involved a sampling plan that was likely to include both situational couple violence and intimate terrorism. Understand that it's very hard to find a study that will do that. The general survey data are so heavily dominated by situational couple violence that it's hard to study intimate terrorism in general surveys. And agency data are heavily dominated by intimate terrorism, so it's hard to study situational couple violence in them. This study had a mixed sampling plan that included both. So I created some measures and made distinctions among the three major types of intimate partner violence in Irene Friese's data from Pittsburgh. You can see that the intimate terrorism in this study was perpetrated 97% of the time by husbands rather than wives. As always with sociologists, you want to remember that we tend to forget the other cases. So don't forget this 3%. Intimate terrorism is not exclusively a male-perpetrated phenomenon. 3% of the intimate terrorism in this study in Pittsburgh was perpetrated by women. In this study in Britain in the 2000s, done by Graham, Kevin, and Archer, the 13% of the intimate terrorism was perpetrated by women, 87% by men. So don't forget, when we give you these numbers, we tend to emphasize the averages or the high percentages. Don't forget the so-called deviant cases. Violent resistance, perpetrated almost entirely by women in the study in Pittsburgh, and situational couple violence, roughly equally perpetrated by men and women. Then the same pattern in the study done in Britain by Graham, Kevin, and Archer, the intimate terrorism, 87% male, the violent resistance, only 10% male, the situational couple violence actually perpetrated more often by women than by men in their study. So there's the data that show you the dramatic, now these are huge differences. We're used, in social science research, we're used to making a big deal out of little differences, right? In this area, we don't have to do that. The differences are huge. Now let's look at the effects of sampling plan. Here's the Pittsburgh data. Because she had her mixed sampling plan, I could look at the mix of the types for a general sample, for a court sample, women who'd filed for protection from abuse orders, and for a shelter sample from shelters in the Pittsburgh area. In the general sample is dominated, 86% of the violence in the general sample was this is male violence I'm talking about, was situational couple violence. In the court sample, quite different pattern, 68% of the violence was intimate terrorism. In the shelter sample, 78% of the violence was intimate terrorism. So you see the agencies are dominated by intimate terrorism. When I did this study, I was surprised. I had written some theoretical pieces before I first did this empirical work, and I had argued that the agency data would be almost entirely intimate terrorism. And I was a little bit surprised, I shouldn't have been, but I was, surprised to find how much situational couple violence there was in the two agencies. Even in the shelter sample, almost 1/5 of the shelter cases were cases of situational couple violence. In retrospect, of course, it makes sense because, as I pointed out earlier, situational couple violence can be chronic, can be severe, can even be homicidal, and can terrify the victim of it. So those victims go to the courts to get protection orders. They go to shelters to get help in getting out of the relationship or in mitigating the violence within it, and they go to the divorce courts to get out of relationships. So we do see a fairly sizable minority of the cases in agency data are the most severe cases of situational couple violence. Again, we see the same pattern in that study in Britain. Intimate terrorism by sample type. In the general sample, only 13% of the men's violence was intimate terrorism. In the shelter sample, 88% of the men's violence was intimate terrorism. So you put these two things together, the biases in the sampling plans and the different gender balance of the different types of intimate partner violence, and you get this ongoing debate with one study presenting general survey data, one side presenting general survey data saying women are as violent as men in intimate relationships, and then often telling stories about intimate terrorism to give you the idea that there are as many battered men as there are battered women, when the data they present are not about what we think of as battery, what we think of as domestic violence, what I call intimate terrorism. The data are about situational couple violence. And on the other side, people presenting the agency data that shows that men are the primary perpetrators. The simple answer is there are different types perpetrated by different people. So let's look now at some of the dramatic, and I mean dramatic, differences among the types. Remember, the types are defined by the pattern of coercive control that's involved in the violence, not by the level of violence, not by the frequency or severity. You can have situational couple violence that's very frequent and severe. You can have intimate terrorism that involves very little violence, but involves a pattern of coercive control. So the first thing I wanted to look at was the nature of the violence and the two major types of male violence. So this is going to focus on men. It started with the Pittsburgh data. Remember what I said, that there are very few couples that experience intimate terrorism. There are a fair number of couples who experience situational couple violence. In the United States, the data suggest about 1 out of 8 couples experience situational couple violence. Remember, though, that for almost half of them, it's one incident. For the other half, you have a chronic problem in which we need to intervene. The general motive to control versus a situational motive. The situational motive may involve some control in the situation itself. You want to win the argument, but it's something that's just rooted in the situational escalation to violence. And if we can intervene in that escalation to violence, we can mitigate this. So let's look first at the severity of the violence. In the Pittsburgh data, 76% of the cases of intimate terrorism involved severe violence. In situational couple violence, only 28% involved severe violence. But now remember, he's a sociologist. He likes to focus on this big difference. But although there's a huge difference, huge by social science standards, don't forget this. Situational couple violence can be severe in, well, 1/4 to 1/3 of the cases here involved severe violence in those Pittsburgh data. What about escalation? In our training at the shelter that I've worked in, we tell our people, if he hits you once, he'll hit you again, and the violence will escalate. Well, turns out that's true for 75% of the cases of intimate terrorism in the Pittsburgh study, but it's not true for situational couple violence, where only 28% of the cases involved in escalation of violence, and in fact, more cases de-escalated than escalated. Finally, what about mutuality? How mutual is the violence? The anti-feminists like to talk about intimate partner violence as mutual combat. Well, it's not very mutual in cases of intimate terrorism, and only 29% of the cases of intimate terrorism was the violence mutual. But in situational couple violence, it's much more likely to be mutual. One partner slaps the other one and gets slapped back. So you've got mutual violence because there's no terrorizing. Whereas in the case of intimate terrorism, while some victims resist with violence at first, they desist, and ultimately you don't get mutual violence. The British study that I've been talking about all along, you see this basically the same pattern. The numbers are different. See, that's the important thing that I want to say. Don't want to write down numbers and say, Johnson says 43% of cases in intimate terrorism involve severe violence, because I just said it was 76%. So now I'm saying it's 43%. Well, it depends on how you measure severity. Different researchers use different ways of deciding what's severe violence and what isn't severe violence. So you'll get different numbers, but the pattern is the same. A much higher likelihood of severe violence with intimate terrorism than with situational couple violence. Different country, different decade, different researchers, same pattern. On escalation, same pattern again. 78% of the intimate terrorism escalated, only 20% of the situational couple violence escalated. Mutuality, low for intimate terrorism, relatively high for situational couple violence. Huge differences in the nature of the violence between the two major types of male violence. Here's a little different take on it from a Canadian study looking at previous and current partners in general survey data. One way to get at intimate terrorism in general survey data is to ask about previous partners, because those people, those victims, are willing to talk about somebody they've already escaped from. So you can get at intimate terrorism if you'll ask about previous partners. In this case, the frequency, 57% of the cases of intimate terrorism involve frequent violence, as opposed to only 8% of the cases of situational couple violence. 60% of the victims of intimate terrorism feared for their lives, as compared with only 9% for situational couple violence. Again, I'll point out we don't want to forget these numbers. About 1/10 of the victims of situational couple violence were afraid for their lives in this Canadian survey data. Now let's go on to some of the other major differences. I'm just going to give you a sprinkling of different major differences that have been found in the research. There are many others I could have put up here. Again, they're from different studies done in different places by different researchers. They're not all done by me, which is always a clue when somebody presents. Well, it's not. I shouldn't say that. This is a better way to establish things. You look at studies done by different people in different places that all confirm the same general pattern. The general pattern here is a simple one. The consequences of intimate terrorism are much more dramatic than are the consequences of situational couple violence. But don't forget, situational couple violence can have dramatic consequences. So as a clinician, you need to look at the specific case and not simply leap to conclusions from the label that's put on the violence. Here's a study of injury in the National Violence Against Women Survey in the United States. When they asked about injuries, they asked only about the most recent incident. So that's all we could look at when we looked at these data. And we found that for 49% of the cases of intimate terrorism, there had been an injury in the most recent incident of violence, whereas that was only 25% for the cases of situational couple violence. But don't forget, that's 1 out of 4 involved in injury in the most recent incident. In the Pittsburgh data, we could look at injuries throughout the course of the relationship. So we looked at the likelihood of a severe injury ever in the relationship in the Pittsburgh data. For 3/4 of the cases of intimate terrorism, there had been a severe injury at some point, as compared with 28% for the situational couple violence. In the National Violence Against Women survey, there were measures of post-traumatic stress symptoms. This is not a clinical diagnosis. It's simply a look at a scale, a questionnaire on symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And the data here are the percent above the median for all of the women who'd experienced violence in the National Violence Against Women survey. And for intimate terrorism, 79% of the women scored above the median on that symptom list for post-traumatic stress, as compared with 37% for situational couple violence. A study done in Chicago in hospitals and clinics around the Chicago area with women who would come in not specifically for domestic violence related problems, but simply the general population coming to those clinics, and then they were screened for violence. So this is a primarily low income, primarily African American sample. 37% of the women experiencing intimate terrorism had either threatened or attempted suicide, as compared with 18% of the women who were experiencing situational couple violence. In the Pittsburgh study, we were able to look at marital happiness. 50% of the women experiencing intimate terrorism were low on a marital happiness scale. It's an important thing to remember. There's much more to these relationships than just the violence. That it's not necessarily the case that a woman who's experiencing intimate terrorism is unhappy with her relationship other than with the violence within it. So when they come to us in the shelters, they'll often say, I don't want to get out of this relationship, I simply want to be safe in it. I want to stop the violence and I want to stop the control, but I would like to stay with my partner. They don't always want to get out of the relationship. Low marital happiness, of course, is much less frequent for couples who are experiencing situational couple violence. This is another measure of happiness with the relationship, whether they've left more than once. High likelihood that intimate terrorists have left more than once. For those of you who work in this area, you know that, well, in the United States, we estimate that a woman will leave her partner up to, they say, I don't know how to tell you the truth, I'm not sure I trust this number. It's another one I don't trust, but I'll give it to you. It takes probably 7 times leaving before a woman permanently leaves an intimate terrorist relationship. The reason is the woman needs to leave safely. So she needs to find the means. Catherine Kirkwood, in her book, Leaving Abusive Relationships, talks about it as a spiral, that a woman in an intimate terrorist situation spirals, goes out and learns some things about how she can leave the relationship safely, and she comes back in. Each time she goes out, she learns more, gains more support. The shelter that she goes to may hook her up with job training, hook her up with social services that can make it more economically viable for her to leave. We'll explain to her how protection from abuse orders work and give her the protection she needs. May tell her they have secure, hidden facilities where she could move with her family. And so slowly, the woman finds a means to get out of the relationship safely and leaves. And so you see a pattern of leaving frequently, coming back, and ultimately, as I said earlier, ultimately most women do leave these kinds of relationships. So what you see here is just a dramatic pattern in study after study after study of huge differences between intimate terrorism and situational couple violence. I'm going to give you just 4 more examples because there are major questions in the literature on intimate partner violence that some researchers thought we had answered 10, 15, 20 years ago. But now that we know that there are different kinds of intimate partner violence, we find that we didn't have the answer because there's not a single answer. There are different answers depending upon the type of violence you're looking at. For example, so-called intergenerational transmission of violence. This is from a meta-analysis that looked at all of the studies that have looked at this. And for intimate terrorism, oh, look at that. I screwed up. This should be, they're all, how did that happen? Oh, well, you can see what's going on here. This is situational couple violence, and these are intimate terrorism. They used to be lined up with each other, and now they're not. So what happens is a very low intergenerational transmission of situational couple violence and a moderate level of transmission for intimate terrorism. If you've experienced violence in your childhood home, you are more likely to be an intimate terrorist when you grow up. Now, this is not my study. This is a meta-analysis. We did one study where we distinguished on the basis of both gender and type of violence, and found that this held only for men. That for men who grow up in violent homes, the odds of becoming an intimate terrorist are 7.5 times higher than if they did not grow up in a violent home. The results for situational couple violence were much less strong. For marriage, there's a famous article by Strauss and one of his colleagues called, Is the Marriage License a Hitting License? And Strauss and a variety of other people claimed to show that there was more violence in cohabiting relationships than in marital relationships. In this Canadian study that distinguished between situational couple violence and intimate terrorism, found that the relationships were in the opposite direction for the 2 types of violence. That for situational couple violence, married couples were less likely to be involved in situational couple violence than were cohabiting couples. For intimate terrorism, married couples were more likely to be involved than cohabiting couples. So for some men, evidently, the marriage license was a license to control, not a license to hit, but a license to control. Gender traditionalism. The anti-feminists like to argue that there's evidence that there's no relationship between gender traditionalism and the likelihood of male intimate partner violence. Turns out when you make the distinction, you get a small negative effect of gender traditionalism for situational couple violence. More traditional men are slightly less likely to be involved in violence toward their partners than are less traditional men. Whereas for intimate terrorism, a strong positive relationship, more traditional men are more likely to be involved in intimate terrorism than less traditional men. Similarly, for hostility toward women, here are the means in hostility toward women for situational couple violence. This mean, by the way, is roughly the same as the mean for men who are not violent toward their partners at all. This is situational couple violence. And then a much higher mean in hostility toward women for men who are involved in intimate terrorism. So, again, the big pattern is huge differences between situational couple violence and intimate terrorism on almost everything that we look at. So, in the time I have left, let me talk a little bit about some of the issues that are involved specifically in this conference. The risk of child abuse, the overlap between child abuse and intimate partner violence has been a source of great debate for the last 20 years. There was a famous literature review done in the 1990s that looked at all of the studies that had been done over the last 20 years on the overlap between intimate partner violence and child abuse, and found that the studies found the overlap to range from 0% to 100%, which didn't really narrow things down very much. Now, once you understand that there are different types of intimate partner violence, you can get a handle on why there's such tremendous variability in the findings across studies. It's because the dynamics of intimate partner violence are dramatically different in the different types of violence. So their implications for the likelihood that there will also be child abuse in the family are dramatically different. For intimate pushed the wrong button, okay. For intimate terrorism, of course, the issue is control. You've got one partner who's trying to take complete control over his or her partner. So then you see abuse of the children involved in the control of the partner in many cases. There are many studies done in shelters that look at this, and the shelters where you find the greatest overlap between intimate partner violence and child abuse, and where they find the use of the children to manipulate or punish the partner. For example, the intimate terrorist will bring the children into the room as he is terrorizing his partner and use the children as part of that situation. We'll ask the children, your mother really is an incompetent mother, isn't she? And the children have to comply. So the children are abused as part of the manipulation of the partner. Or the partner can be violent towards the children to punish his partner, right? Either you comply with me or the children will pay for it. I'll be violent towards the children if you don't comply. So you'll see that's one source of the overlap. The second source of the overlap for intimate terrorism, particularly in cases of antisocial intimate terrorists, remember these are men who will have their own way and will do whatever they need to get their way. So they may be involved in controlling their children, abusing their children as well. That's not as likely for the emotionally dependent intimate terrorists, where the focus is almost entirely on their need to keep their partner. So they're not as likely to turn their controlling and abusive behavior on their children as are the antisocial intimate terrorists. So I should have said when I started this, I'm sticking my neck out here, right? This is a lot of speculation on my part. We don't have research. I can't show you numbers on this in the way I'll be able to show. I could show you numbers on the other things that we've talked about so far. But I'm pretty confident of what I'm saying about this. You as clinicians can think this through yourselves and ask yourselves what the differences might be for the different types of intimate partner violence. For situational couple violence, where there's conflict escalation, the likelihood of an overlap with child abuse would depend upon the source of the violence escalation. Remember what I said? There's tremendous variability. 10 minutes. There's tremendous variability among cases of situational couple violence. I asked him to do that. He's not badgering me. He's just doing what I asked him to do. Substance abuse may be involved. If the substance abuse creates violence primarily because it's a source of conflict, then it's not likely to overlap with child abuse, right? The kids aren't going to be arguing with dad or mom about their drinking and leading to an escalation of violence. But if the substance abuse is involved because it's affecting the dynamics of escalation, because when the person is drunk, they're more likely to escalate to violence, that escalation can happen in conflicts with the children as well as in conflicts with the partner. So the overlap with child abuse would depend upon how the substance abuse is implicated in the creation of violence in the relationship. If the issue is primarily an anger management issue of one or both of the partners, that's going to be an issue with the children as well. So you would get overlap for cases where the intimate partner violence, the situational couple violence, is primarily due to an inability of one or both of the partners to control their anger. That may lead to abuse of the children. especially if the woman is the one that has the anger management problems, because feminist, as we all like to think things have become, egalitarian as we think families are nowadays, in fact, women still have primary responsibility for the care of children, so they're put into situations of conflict with their children much more often than are men. So women with anger management problems are going to be more likely to be abusive towards their children than are men who have less opportunity to be abusive. If the issues are primarily coupled communication issues, no reason to expect a major overlap with child abuse. It's an issue of how the couple handles their disagreements with each other that may not generalize to the way they deal with their children. So you can see it's quite complicated, that you can't make a simple statement about the increased likelihood of child abuse if there is intimate partner violence in a family. Here's one way of looking at the data that suggests some support for the general observation that there will be more overlap for intimate terrorism than there will be for situational couple violence. This is from a literature review that was published fairly recently, in which I could separate out the studies that use shelter data from the one study of male partner violence that used a general survey study. And what you see is that the highest level of overlap is for the shelter data, which is dominated by intimate terrorism, and a very low overlap for this community study. There are some other general survey studies that didn't distinguish between husbands and wives in terms of their abuse of the children that show the same pattern, but I wanted to show you the male violence. The studies that just said, was there a parent who was violent towards a child, show the same pattern, very low overlap between intimate partner violence and child abuse in those studies. Okay, now let's briefly talk about the role of alcohol in the violence. Again, different dynamics for the different types. For intimate terrorism, what I would predict is that there'll be no effect on incidents, that the alcohol doesn't cause the violence. It's the need to control that causes the violence. So whether the perpetrator is drunk or sober will have no effect on whether he uses violence, needs to use violence in order to control his partner. But it will affect the severity of the violence because of the well-demonstrated effects of alcohol on the escalation of violence. For situational couple violence, where the dynamic is one of conflict escalation, the role of alcohol, there are two major roles of the alcohol. First is alcohol as the source of conflict. If there's alcohol or other substance abuse in the family, that may be a continuing source of conflict as the non-abusing partner attempts to intervene in the abusing behavior, in the substance abusing behavior of his or her partner. So that may create conflicts that potentially could escalate to violence. Second, the dynamics of the escalation to violence may be affected by substance abuse, as people are more likely to become verbally aggressive and escalate to physical violence when they're not sober. There is some evidence on this, and some very nice evidence, although most of it is from one group of researchers. Paul Stewart and his colleagues have done dozens of studies of the role of alcohol in intimate partner violence. You all are probably aware that there have been lots of survey studies that show that couples that are involved in violence are more likely to have substance abuse issues. But that doesn't really establish cause and effect. It just says that the kinds of couples that drink excessively are also the kinds of couples who are violent. What Paul Stewart and his colleagues do is to use daily log data so they can look at the effects of alcohol abuse on a specific day on the likelihood of violence. And what they find, what that does is to establish alcohol as a cause. That they're studying men and women who have come in for alcohol abuse interventions, and they have them do daily logs on both their violence and their alcohol abuse, and what they show is a strong relationship between excessive drinking early in the day that there is violence. So that what they find is that on the days when there is violence, there's a much higher likelihood that the violent person has been drinking before the violent incident, so they can establish the causal order. They use behavioral couples therapy. I'll be talking more about that this afternoon in my workshop. And their behavioral couples therapy enhances the success. Their behavioral couples therapy is more effective than their individual therapy in two ways. It is more likely to reduce the abuse of alcohol when you get the couple involved than when you treat only the individual abuser. And second, it decreases the violence in the relationship. And most importantly, the reason it decreases the violence is not because the men are more likely to be sober, but because on the days that they're drunk, they're not as likely to be violent. So the violence intervention that they combine with their substance abuse intervention breaks the tie between the alcohol abuse and the violence. So that there's a great incidence of relapse on substance abuse programs. So just getting men to not drink isn't going to necessarily eliminate the violence, because when they relapse, then they become violent again. So they use this combined approach of doing both the alcohol abuse intervention and a violence intervention, so that the men and their female partners have learned ways to stop the violence when the drinking starts to escalate. But important for me, Paul Stewart and his colleagues did one study where they distinguished between men with antisocial personality disorder and men who didn't have antisocial personality disorder. And they found that their behavioral couples therapy was not effective for men with antisocial personality disorder, the very men who are most likely to be intimate terrorists. So that confirms my speculation that it will not have an effect on the use of violence. Oh, I should have put up here. In addition, they found in this study that it did have an effect on severity of the violence. So it didn't affect the likelihood that antisocial personality disordered men would be violent, but it affected the severity of their violence. If they were drinking less, their violence was less severe. And finally, an interesting study, because it turns the tables a bit. Denise Hines is a researcher who's been doing most of the work in the United States on male victims of intimate terrorism. And she did a study in which she looked at alcohol and found that the male victims drinking affected the likelihood of their being victimized by situational couple violence. Their drinking affected the dynamics of escalation, whereas their drinking did not affect the likelihood of their being victims of intimate terrorism. So it's a slightly different twist on it, because it deals with male victims, and also because it looks at the victim's drinking behavior in its relationship to violence in relationships. So go back to the big point. I said I was going to make one point today. That's it, that we make big mistakes if we don't make these big distinctions, because the different types of violence have different causes, different dynamics, different developmental pathways, and we need to intervene in them in different ways. I always end with this slide just because I love that picture. There's a picture earlier in the book of this woman when she first came into the shelter with her baby to escape from an intimate terrorist relationship. And then I got a picture of her at night after they'd gone to sleep in a shelter in Philadelphia. There are two slides following this one that have references that might be useful to you. I won't go on to them, but if this is up on the website for this conference, you'll be able to get them there, and I will be putting them up, don't forget, on my website as soon as I get back to the United States. So, thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.